make sense because there's an inbuilt underrepresentation. The person with the most votes gets a constituency, everyone else is de facto not represented through their vote. So what you have, you create larger constituencies with multiple members, and you have transferable voting. So you say, I quite like candidate A, but I'm not going to just vote for candidate A, I also quite like B, just a little bit less than A. So you rank your preferences so that ultimately you're not represented by one member but by three, for example, in a larger constituency, and that will make politics truly more representative. At the moment, in the first past the post system, we don't have representation. Labour has a majority nominally of 170 or even more than that, on a popular vote of not even 34%, with a total, I think, voter turnout of under 60%, which means that fewer than a quarter of Britons voted for a government that has a two-thirds, that has two-thirds of the seats in the House of Commons. That's not representative democracy.
Right, good. Thank you very much indeed, everyone. So we're going to break for an hour now, and I think we'll go to the refectory, as it's very, very nearby. And then we'll reassemble round about 2 if we can manage it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Are you ready now?
Yep.
Ready.
Oh, go on.
Okay, everyone.
Ready.
Sorry, we're fixing the videographer.
Yeah. Okay. Are we ready?
We're good. Okay.
Hello, everybody. After a delicious lunch, and Adrian and I have got ice creams as well. But, so welcome to the third session, which is called The Triumph of the Possible, and is going to be introduced by Anna Kenzie-Winters. So the third pillar of modern thought is the modal priority of the possible over the actual. Without the ultimate actuality of God, the actuality of what exists is subordinated to its possibility, at once to logic and to power. Since possibility is without limit, technology is unbound, and we identify progress with the unleashing of possibility as such, with indifference as to ethical or aesthetic value. On the same view, organisation becomes accident, and thought reducible to logical or machinic process, shadowed by the ever further unleashing of unconscious passion. Everything concrete is designated by abstract money and the brute force of the state and the military. Without any assumption of actual form or formation as primary, civilization dissolves. It turns out that we cannot do without the supposedly mythical mediation between nature and conscious mind that gives us our founding civilizational narratives and paradigms in the form of myth, religion, and philosophy. How today to restore the primacy of the actual and the psychic as the civilizational. How then, if we do that, avoid the clash of civilizations. So over to you, Anna.
Okay. So I'll be reading out the little talk that I've prepared on this topic, and we can have a discussion after. So I'll be briefly addressing 2 metaphysical themes bearing on this problem of post-liberalism and actualism, before tracing out their connection to liberalism's politics of negative freedom, as well as the political theologies deployed to authorize these politics. These themes are 1, the supernatural and the natural, concerning the mystical status of human ends, and 2, divine possibility, the question, does God suffer? How we answer these questions is not simply a matter of obscure theological disputation, but affects the most intimate and practical questions of politics, culture, and social order. Firstly, I want to suggest that the question of the supernatural is the principal hinge upon which this entire problem, the modal problem of political theology, turns. Even the most possibilist thinker, in some fundamental sense, cannot deny actuality. They can only treat actuality as purely naturalistic, and so submitted to the possible as nature is submitted to our own demands on it. arbitrary human desires then gradually substitute for the locus of the supernatural altogether, and at the limit enchanting only spiritually unreflected fantasies. This generates a critical and relativistic circuit in which any supernatural claim is treated suspiciously, as equally fantastical. But if actuality is itself understood to be irreducibly supernatural, as the inseparable telos of the natural itself, and if this supernatural actuality can be discussed meaningfully in a community of spiritual initiation, then the actual ceases to function as the object of the possible, but rather regulates the possible as part of a shared approach to an ultimate spiritual good. The contentious thesis of divine possibility, meanwhile, interprets biblical symbolism according to the premise that God is ultimately affected fully within himself, reciprocally by his own creation, thus in some sense leveling out the established hierarchy of creator and creation. Many modern theologians, such as Jürgen Moltmann, see this as a progressive view, providing an account of God where creaturely suffering becomes a more ethically urgent problem, as it is suggested that this suffering is shared with God himself. But this narrative functionally compounds the triumph of possibilism, because as God is increasingly identified with suffering material nature, the ethical urgency falls to human formal manipulation of this nature. Thus we actually lose the locus of God as nature's supernatural telos, deifying instead the human biopolitical project of naturalistically reducing suffering, the concept of the good which ambiguously identifies God himself with suffering, such that the possible negations of this negativity become more meaningful and vital than the protection of positive actuality. As such, the metaphysically and often physically violent negation of this positive actuality is considered enriching, progressive, and an instrumentally justified clearing away of vulnerable realities to serve merely possible futures. This instrumentalism functionally takes Martin Luther's principle of theology of the cross and turns it into the symbolic imposition of crucifixion on others as a normative, negatively initiatory process for society at large, in contrast to the established approach of Christian ascetic and monastic communities, which was to willingly adopt certain forms of self-denial in order to better facilitate the collective discernment of supernatural goods and their connection with vital actualities. As such, in a certain basic sense, the possibilist premises of liberalism functionally deny the fundamental exercise of positive freedom in the attainment of virtue. Thus, freedom comes to be exercised in a pure politics, founded on the imposition of one's preferred possibilities onto others, rather than through the cultivation of a supernatural telos inclusive of one's politically mediated actuality. If self-realization is treated in terms of a liberal negative freedom, actually, I'm going to add one more thing. In this process of secular purification, the left and the right increasingly reduce themselves to reactive caricatures of the other side's fears, delighting most in the sadistic intimidation and defeat of their chosen enemies. If self-realization is treated in terms of a liberal negative freedom, as a freedom from other obstacles, this increasingly converges towards a politics of control, oriented towards those who are made to stand in for the formal obstacles that seemingly limit the perpetual expansion of possibility. In this way, a fascist logic of compulsive scapegoating itself forms the horizon of liberal negative freedom, which we are today observing in contemporary political developments. I would argue that the only way to avoid this transmutation of liberalism into fascism is a non-identical return to a politics of supernaturally elected virtue, that is, a positive freedom in the cultivation of supernaturally conditioned norms which confirm, preserve, and realize actuality on a higher spiritual level than is possible with the polymorphous relativity of matter alone. This relativity unfortunately renders the modern immanent frame fundamentally self-contradictory, such that the achievement of possibilist ends ultimately submits them to the exigencies of empty power, rather than defending anything of the actualities of those who pursue them. This defense of natural actuality, which itself requires the displacement of the natural to the supernatural, can be forwarded as one interpretation of the biblical theme of losing one's life in order to gain it. The biggest obstacle in theological culture that I see as interfering with the development of a new spiritual actualism after modernity is the foundation of the United States, our international hegemonic power, on an attitude of perpetual religious dissent. The glorification of dissent, rebellion, and the discovery of new political utopian purities, separated from older structures, preserving supernatural narrativity, seems to me to threaten the reputation of early Christianity as a farce. Rather than the humble positive cultivation of virtue, lucidly counseled by St. Paul, what we see here is, I would argue, a more prideful attitude of the highest good, being one of effective control over others, as a telos of resistance to others' power is treated as the ultimate horizon of human life. This just ends up ethically bankrupting the ideals of Christianity itself for much of the population, as Christianity increasingly appears as a control mechanism, resistance to which just reproduces the same cancerous logic of perpetual schism and negative freedom, blind to its effect of functionally deifying its own enemy. In the case of certain contemporary political visionaries like Peter Thiel, what we see is the appropriation of Christian anthropology for a neo-reactionary transhumanism, in which only that which can be completely transformed and humanly perfected through the power of pure manipulable potentiality survives in the future. He compares this to the Christian supernatural horizon, rather than incarnationally preserving what is actual through a principle of resurrection in the face of promise of despair. The fundamental premise is instead functionally that of an imposed universal crucifixion. The dissolution of actual form and the endlessly variable vain fantasies of total material self-transformation, at the expense of any actualities whatsoever, which I would argue can only conclude in a total war of all against all, where incommensurable potentialities perpetually vie with each other to see who is most capable of the technical manipulation which most effectively crushes all the others, a deliberately staged enactment of the Hobbesian drama. Thiel's interpretation of René Girard's Christian anthropology of mimetic violence functionally just naturalizes and intensifies the mimetic condition of sin identified by Girard, evading any prospect of supernatural countermimesis, and substituting resigned anthropological suspicion along with biblically metaleptic narrative justification of social control for any genuine Christian virtue or charity. This, too, is the legacy of Carl Schmitt's political theology from the neo-reactionary thinkers like Curtis Yarvin, an endless cycle of scapegoating those who scapegoat, trading structural places with one's enemy by cowering under the specter of possible harms, preempted merely as actual harms absent actual goods. Even the alleged goods appealed to by Dark Enlightenment authors like Land are purely virtual, with artificial superintelligence as a makeshift human-created God arriving from the future, an empty tautological promise on the ground that intelligence always wins, with no claim to actual ultimacy and certainly not to virtue. This is the fruit of naturalizing actuality and reducing the divine to a merely potential object of human activity, which is then rendered in the anti-humanist light of having its merely material actuality usurped by the formal operations of endlessly reconfigurable technical structures. In this vision, the essence of intelligence is identified with ecstatic ingratitude towards given actuality. Even if the competitive struggle for ever greater potentialities is an irreducible element of material reality, its transposition to the ultimate purpose of our lives can only prioritize the empty acquisition of power, capitalistic expansion, callous sacrifice of others, ultimately ourselves as well, and all manner of death-infatuated vexation and vanity over the intrinsic value of what is precious in actual life itself, preserved at its limit through the supernatural horizon of virtue. This is not to say that the actual is only something to be preserved, as it is also something that, for finite creatures, must be perpetually discovered, in the shadow of the ever deeper actuality of divine mystery. It is to say, however, that preserving human actuality is a condition for approaching the ultimate actuality of God, rather than losing both in the abyss of the merely possible, the false promise of the perpetually unactivated.
Thank you very much indeed, Anna. And I found that really illuminating and rewarding. I don't know what other people felt about it. Are there any immediate reactions?
I'd just like to ask about the connection between Girard and Schmitt. And I know it's a very open-ended question, but would it be possible to elaborate on the connection made between the account of the Girardian mimesis and Schmitt's friend-enemy distinction?
Yeah, well, I think in this case, there's very much kind of this shared Hobbesian background and sort of a set of presuppositions that both are kind of engaging with from different directions. Part of the difficulty is that, in a sense, what Girard, you can read Girard as kind of a counter-Schmittian thinker in a very specific way, which is that the idea of counter-mimesis as sort of a limit on mimetic violence doesn't necessarily happen strictly through the state, because he's sort of integrating the concept of Christianity, Christ's sort of sacrifice, and the church as sort of like mediating and managing that kind of push towards ritual violence more than the state actually could. And Schmitt kind of undermines this by having this sort of focus on sovereign decision, which in principle is unbounded. So it's like there's nothing that necessarily sort of stops the sovereign from furthering the mimetic process in Schmitt. Whereas with Girard, the kind of Christian ethos that he's promoting is supposed to stop the violence. The problem is that when you still kind of underwrite your anthropology on this sort of Hobbesian foundation of like violence being the fundamental state of man, then that becomes so much the focus, and managing that violence becomes so much the focus that you aren't really able to talk about an actual good that has a supernatural quality to it beyond sort of immanence to humanity. And this is what we see how people like Peter Thiel and like in his essay, The Straussian Moment, he synthesizes Girard and Schmidt to talk about this, where it's sort of like, specifically to talk about kind of Christianity as an strictly anthropologically conceived ethos. So there's no longer a question of an actual supernatural order. And this is sort of what I'm saying is sort of the really decisive aspect of, if you want to have an actualism, you need a supernatural actuality. Because if your actuality is sort of really natural, then you just, possibility becomes the highest thing. Like what occupies the order of the supernatural is possibility. And actuality is dissolved into it. And this is we see this with Thiel. Thiel is using the Girardian narrative, which is supposedly Catholic. He's taking it out of its context and just deploying it to defend a kind of neo-Schmittian, neo-reactionary liberalism. So.
Yeah, and it also shows what a load of total nonsense people, so-called Thomist defending guilt nature are on about, because you can't really separate the natural desire of the supernatural from Thomist naturalism, because they go together in a way that I think are eliminated. Because as soon as you have pure nature, automatically your tendency will then be to see the possible as primary.
Yeah.
And you will reduce the natural law to, things like ownership and formalities and so on. Whereas the whole point about the primacy of the actual is it involves this sort of counterintuitive thing that the actual has priority even over the future because there's God, because there's a higher actuality. And this also sort of helps us to evaluate the tradition and so on, because we see that even finite actualities are not closed in their very actuality and are heading towards it. And this is similarly, the blindness in MacIntyre of not seeing that the loss of teleology goes along with the rise of pure nature, because of course if teleology is fundamental, then naturally the ultimate teleology always trumps, or always secretly trumps the natural telos, which can only be. But by now, of course, Sister Marie de l'Assomption, who is, Paul Claudel's great granddaughter, has absolutely demolished all this American pseudo-Catholic crap. She has shown conclusively that de Lubac is right about Aquinas and extended his thesis. So that's, I think, one important aspect of what you're doing. I suppose, one interesting question to ask you, nonetheless, would be, is there any danger in pure actuality of freezing things? And should we be looking at the sort of Neoplatonic tendency to transcend even the contrast between the actual and so Nicholas Accuser, for example, sort of God is beyond even that prayer. Is there any value in that? Or
I think that there is value in that, but I guess what happens when you have that kind of you're passing through the unity of opposites and the kind of holding those contraries together in a kind of hyperbolic apopaticism of God, when you get there, maybe that is sort of fundamentally true on the level of facilitating certain kinds of mystical experiences. But in some sense, it already assumes that the kinds of disputes in political theology that we're talking about have sort of been set aside and have been kind of worked through on some basic level. A lot of these sorts of visionary kinds of theological metaphysics are sort of for religious adepts, right? People who are kind of specifically Cousteau's writing for Catholics. It's people who are in the church and who are cultivating sanctifying spiritual life within the church. And
I think that's fair enough. I think this can get rather esoteric, but I think if you have this sense that even sort of what somehow corresponds to dynamism in God is not beyond the action. If in some mystical way God exceeds our contrast, which dream of estimation, then you're sort of not tempted towards supposing that there is some sort of reserve in God, that, you know, his actuality might include a different decision. You know, so that even in Aquinas, there's, you know, this is what people like Bulgakov, the late John Hughes has pointed out, you know, there is this germ of distinction between God's absolute and ordained power, which surely is not consistent somehow with the divine simplicity, and opens the way to voluntarism and the idea there's some reserved potentiality in God. So perhaps we need the paradox that actus purus is also is somehow not negating potentiality, but is the fullness of virtus as even a kind of sort of half, you know.
Yeah, well, in some sense, you can say either it's, you know, God is neither of these modal positions, or God is sort of both of them.
Yes.
And so in a sense, it really just depends on kind of apophatic or cataphatic discourse in the theology question. But yeah, in principle, what actually happens here is that if you are saying both of them, you're sort of changing what you mean by actual. And like kind of in the final paragraph of what I wrote, I do try to gesture towards this, that this is also where analogy is so important, because if there is kind of that analogical interval and you're not reducing everything to univocal immanence, then how you can think of actuality is opened up to kind of like, to actually even be in the actual requires a perpetual process for finite creatures.
And I think it somehow sort of guards against the temptation to think that we have now captured the divine actuality, you know, without sort of absolutizing possibility and change. You are sort of more, and again, this is this slight Renaissance thing, you're holding open the sense that we live in time, and we're developing, and nature developing, we're co-developing, but you're keeping this within a sort of participatory scheme and a scheme of sort of better discernments, but you know, you're seeing the actual as not sort of closed off to traditional development, but this is something like that. But I thought, you know, it was really fascinating the way that you're showing how this possibilism lurks behind this kind of liberal pessimism, as Adrian and I have described it, you know, that, and you see this in apparently subversive figures like Thiel and the Schmittian legacy, that it's really very modern in its sort of voluntarism, possibilism, and Jim, that indeed, I mean, I used to talk to René Jarry, he was definitely liberal, he was a really political liberal, because of this degree of pessimism, even though he talks about positive magnesis and desire, he seems to give very little room for it, so that at that point, that you have to have very disciplinary mechanisms of the state or the market, you know, to restrain the mimetic contagion of mimetic desire. And this is why I think this popularity of Girard is deeply, I mean, elsewhere I tried to present, and it isn't true anthropologically, his thesis about that, and so on, but nonetheless it's very seductive for a lot of people, but it does in the end, I think, play into a very right kind of liberal politics. And I really love the way you suggested that kind of this stress on the suffering God and so on tends to validate our suffering and the necessity for our suffering, so that this kind of liberal theology also plays into the hands of a libertarian right.
This is my implicit critique of Hegel as well, and also ultimately kind of aspects of the Marxist tradition where people like Jürgen Moltmann is interesting because for people who don't know about him, he's a Protestant theologian who's sort of synthesizing aspects of Hegelianism and sort of Marxist theological materialism for kind of a sort of liberation theology of like the suffering God suffers with suffering people. But like in a sense this kind of is a perpetual reenactment of this sort of basic movement of secularization where God is brought down purely to the level of human beings. And so, you know, all that can ever happen in our relationship to God is sort of like our sort of self-contradictorily self-contradictory, sort of intra-anthropological struggles. And like this is the case with Milbank, this is the case in a different way with Girard. It's the same problem. It's like they're so focused on anthropology in some sense. God becomes anthropological in different ways for both.
You sacralize the negative, right? I mean, negative theology is a sort of infinite progress towards the positive that's balanced by integration, but sacralizing the negative, which is the Hegelian view, is a terrible mistake. And of course, this is why Schelling, talking about the positive and the limits of that, if you sacralize the negative, you're either trapped in logic or you're trapped in force, and endless, only negative emancipatory overcoming. And so this is the primacy of the positive in Schelling that always is a meta-critique of that. And, the left absolutely needs to go in more Schellingian direction. Ari.
Thank you, Anna. It's interesting, I think, the fact that we talk about post-liberalism and liberalism, and in fact, the solution to liberalism provides is actually everything is compossible. If you just find the right arrangement of univocally related things, according to an ideological representation, you will basically achieve, and certainly what Malton is, what you find pragmatically in the affairs of the church is what this kind of bottom-up Christology ends up certainly subsidizing and is ultimately kind of this decline back into kind of there's no discipline there.
But this also relates to the problem that Arnav is indicating on the left, of belief in a sort of compossibility, that once you've undone capitalism completely, you will have entered into this sort of Rousseauian paradise where everything will be so obvious that we'll always agree. Whereas, on the contrary, in the finite and, for Christians, fallen world, there are always going to be apparent incompatibilities and, and balances to be struck, between urban convenience and rural beauty, just to give a sort of really simplistic example. We're not going to totally escape this, which doesn't mean that we can't discern some kind of better balance, but nonetheless there isn't an automatic compossibility. And again, it's then you're trying to mediate between different actualities. There isn't some kind of possibilistic one-dimensional calculus, that we can feed into AI or something and come up with the right solution. And it's as Adrian was saying, the left is absolutely affected by its utilitarianism or possibility and positivism, which plays always into the hands of the enemy.
My question was going to be, could you link with this idea, specifically under the aspect of actualism and positivism? You've spoken about there's a possibility in this kind of virtual realm of, and ultimately this is psychological. The psychological just, plays as much of a role in this as purely sort of theoretical. So if we think about positivism not in terms of safety culture, the preemption of things that are dangerous, but in terms of, shadows ultimately which are conjured up by ideology. And if, modern life is itself a kind of ideological cover, then what happens with these kinds of active shadows and the activist hysteric, these sort of people, who, like I said, put forward the bills and so, abortion and so on. Is there a link between these two, these shadows of ideology, which moves and shakers of kind of liberal discourse, the possibilism which underlies it, and ultimately, the psychological apparatus of the people who end up enacting these in purpose? Do you see what's there?
Yeah, I definitely think that there is a connection, and there's a certain type of political hysteria that you bring up. It connects back to something from the earlier session, Adrian session, when I brought up the problem of radical evil. So I do feel also one aspect of that I meant to mention there, which is also relevant here and kind of goes back around to the Schmittian problem, is that I think a key insight in the first chapter of John's Being Reconciled is this sort of recognition that Kant's concept of radical evil, which sort of takes him away from the purgation theory of evil, leads also to kind of a more subservient attitude towards the political sovereign. And the reason for this is simply that it's like, again, if evil is hypothesized as kind of a positive negativity or a sacralized negativity, rather than kind of just, well, we're just not at the higher possibility. Then what that means essentially is like, the political sovereign functionally substitutes for the divine sovereign, because you need this is the whole Hegelian problem. You need the negation of a negation rather than the positive.
Which leads to that kind of narrative of or rhetoric that people don't know, so we better choose for them as a kind of imposition for their own sake, rather than kind of pedagogical.
Yeah.
Well, also what this means is that if a person is guilty of sin, guilty of error, rather than metanoia, rather than merely the changing of all that they already are, which is created, if radical evil exists, the only solution is purgative, or even removing them entirely if the thing cannot be purged, if the tumour is too large, as it were. And so the response it necessitates is one that's so much more radically exclusionary, and therefore implicitly denies the full humanity of creative humanity.
And the thing is, the reason why Girard is having such a renaissance right now is he provides a convincing anthropological phenomenology of this exact phenomenon. But again, the problem is, in some sense, it's like by fixating on it so much, he doesn't actually have a solution for it except for exactly the one that it imminently generates. It's just sort of describing, kind of, in some sense, I think it is like the fundamental barrier, sort of spiritually, at like
the liberal fly.
It's a wasp.
It's a jasper.
It's a wait, what's that Pabst? So I feel like this sort of Girardian dynamic of the scapegoating ritual violence. I mean, one of the key insights of it that I think you can take out of his own framework is that this is the sort of attitude of a kind of pagan religiosity, and it's in the process of sort of the decline of Christianity in modernity. I think kind of does go along with this same practice, where it's like you need to kind of have this ritual purgative violence that kind of enacts this process of we're projecting the evil onto some kind of hypothesized positivity in the world that is expunged, and we then at the same time we kind of fetishize the sort of sovereign sort of god king or whatever who's implementing that process. But this is a paganization, and then it's kind of this happens as a paganization of Christianity and as a reduction.
I completely agree. This is the way in which sort of the whole Protestant tendency to believe in absolute depravity tends to then recycle the primacy of ontological violence in paganism. In effect, we live in a world totally dominated by the agonistic, and therefore you have to make continuous sacrifices to angry gods.
Yes.
This is what's discerned by John Buchan in his great novel Witchwood, where the evil witchcraft people by night are Calvinists by day. And Buchan was a really, really great novelist. It's tragic, people only know 39 steps, but he exactly sees what's horrible in the Calvinistic mentality and psyche, and he even sort of invokes the Catholic world of fairy and enchantment as the only possible antidote to this Protestant duality. Can I hasten to say at this point, many Scottish Presbyterian theologians have transcended that Calvinism. I'm not, one should never condemn entire cultures. It's never simple, but Calvinism is disgusting. And people who are Calvinists, it's very wrong.
I have a little question or comment. This question about postmodernism has one can see in the 60s and 1960s, so they were saying okay, now you can get divorced, now you can have multiple partners, and there was a genuine sense that being post-liberalistic would have results, you could actually transform your life in lots of different ways. So if you have a horizon of possibility, it gave you this like sort of real world possibility to transform. And then obviously now if you look at like sort of modern society, like divorce isn't exciting in any way. So like has our like actual real possibility narratives? How does the possibility like as a transcendental narrative change?
Yeah, it feeds into this, but I guess part of what is kind of crucial about the idea of a supernatural actuality. So you kind of, when someone's values are fundamentally about sort of, and I did sort of make this a theme of my argument because I think this is a crucial way in, but when someone's fundamental values are kind of about kind of fragile, finite, vulnerable actualities, then that also sort of is kind of unstable in the sense that there is sort of this investment fundamentally in like the possibility of kind of like maintaining them kind of against change or achieving them if that's what one wants and does not currently have. So then kind of the obstacle that exists there between either the obstacle to like protecting what you need to protect or to getting what you need to get kind of starts to loom so large basically over something that in some sense is an actuality, but that is not sort of threatened by this obstacle that, like, I think for someone who's sort of drawn into this sort of spiritual economy, ends up becoming, like, as effectively substitutes for God as kind of like the, evil God of Gnosticism. This is why I think a lot of people talk about Gnostic return in modernity, that it's like in this sort of process of kind of this, like, and it obviously is worse when it's like what makes your life worth living is harder for you to access, and this is your spiritual horizon, then it's like what you end up with is kind of just this like, how are you not going to, especially in like the information economy with all of these people promising secret wisdom online, how are you not going to fall down some kind of horizon of like hysterical Gnosticism and calling for the pagan ritual destruction. So I feel like this is sort of like just it's not just kind of a weird, a lot of the cultural sort of struggles, culture war situation that we're seeing. It's not just kind of like a phenomenal, this is sort of, something that's going to be corrected in a few years. Maybe something will happen and it won't be as intense for whatever reason at some point, but I do think that it's built in the underlying structure of modernity, and like the sort of, fascist or even communist kind of excesses of the 20th century are part of this, and the reason they're coming back is because we haven't addressed this underlying spiritual crisis that conditions this mode of living. And people are afraid, I think, for a lot of reasons that go back to the war of religion and the legacy of the Reformation.
Yeah. No, I completely agree. And despite the differences, we do seem to be back into that sort of liberal quasi-fascist oscillation. And I think we underestimate the degree to which, the New Deal, 1945, welfare settlements, the founding of the EU, these were kind of the last attempts at something a little bit Christian, and a lot of the origins behind them in sort of Christianity, 19th century idealism, romanticism, are sort of almost like neo-Gothic attempts to qualify and I don't think it's an accident that we had a relatively good period after the Second World War, and I think historians are more alert now to the Christian dimension of this, the reassertion of human dignity, the restriction of eugenicism and all that. But then it wasn't enough, it wasn't self-conscious enough, it hadn't resolved the contradictions of a capitalist order, and then it all collapses, and we're back now in that awful oscillation, which is exactly as you described. Yeah,
they're all examples you described of positive freedom, such that what they do, New Deal, the Foundation of International Alliances, what they're all doing is they're all diffusing power and authority through collective participation, whereas the negative liberty of the kind opened up by the widening of the horizon of the possible, you are now free to take these decisions to an unprecedented, to a degree hitherto not seen before. It's easy, I think, for people to underestimate just how Promethean the task of the possible seems for most people, for all of us really, in at least one respect or another. And when a person is, I think, overawed by the task of, I mean, I hate to use a term from a thinker who has given us very little to be grateful for, Jean-Paul Sartre, but to say that a person who's troubled by bad faith, a person who acts in bad faith and says, I cannot bear to take responsibility for my choices even though they are in truth wholly my own, what does that person search for to find psychological relief? They search for the security of a strong hand taking those choices for them in the form of communism, in the form of fascism, in the form of any kind of strong force. And I think that's something that more attention ought to be paid to, the fact of diffusing some of these particular expressions of freedom in a way that is positive as opposed to merely negative. You end up creating a situation where a person devoid of sufficient support from the collective tailspins and immediately reaches for whatever will be the most powerful comfort blanket.
So, yeah, I mean, I think a crucial point here is that there is such a thing as kind of like, worldly positive freedom. It's not all something that you can put off onto like, oh, this is a church thing, this is a religion thing.
Exactly.
And I mean, this is a lot of why I'm so impressed by the Politics of Virtue project that John and Adrian have been working on. And kind of especially this idea of sort of a return to like the sort of guild ethos of the Middle Ages and a new kind of form of guild socialism. And I think this also has a lot of interesting overlap with some people kind of in like sort of cybernetic politics. I have some friends who are like engaged kind of like, with decentralized autonomous organizations and that sort of thing. And they also have this very similar idea of like you have almost sort of this like neo-corporatist kind of like multiple levels of mediation, sort of social structures that are enabling constraints for people to participate in and do things through. And kind of having like lots of structures like that in a society, I think, is also just a social instantiation of that sort of theological assumption of like there is an alternate horizon of positive freedom or ontology of peace or whatever. So that isn't the side of it. I guess I tend to emphasize the religious aspect, and in some ways this is me kind of falling to liberal pessimism sometimes, I think, where it's like sort of just the sense of kind of people who don't have that conviction and that kind of faith in like there is an ultimate peace and there is an ultimate horizon and kind of a positive freedom that we can participate in through God. It's so easy to kind of fall into like these very sort of often unconscious but like very deep-seated sort of psychological and theoretical, philosophical, practical, polemical traps. But yeah, I think it's possible even without a lot of those, like, I mean, a lot of my friends who understand this problem too, like people working on cybernetic politics, they're not Catholic, but they are, oftentimes they're sort of spiritually engaged, but they're also like passionate about social positive freedom as just like pushing back against kind of this tide of like the sacralization of the negative, which is just so tempting right now.
Yeah, and I think it was always the ethos of maybe the most successful sort of pre-contemporary period application of cybernetics to public policy in Chile. But even CyberSyn itself, if you actually look at what the system that Beer Design comprised of, to be blunt, it was basically just an information exchange system. It was a way of streamlining the communication of information from particular factories to other factories in real time, such that they could make real-time decisions about where to increase and decrease production. It was very simple, genuinely very simple, and eminently practical, and definitely not something that is the product of a messianic spiritual vision. Nevertheless, I don't want to lose my train of thought. I have. Completely.
It's really honest.
So what's your, how do you propose that we sort of get back to a state of actuality? And I mean, and just another question, kind of like, if this sort of potentiality has like a kind of entropic function of sort of giving without sort of like, it kind of like, it gives these possibilities to people, but it doesn't actually sort of create the sort of material for people to like actualize any sort of possibility. And if like that general direction is entropic, it kind of goes to your point, Adrian, that like it is like this sort of liberal possibilism is ultimately self-defeating. It's kind of it has like a function in world history, and its function is entropic, and it will ultimately die. But if it doesn't ultimately die, how would you kill it quicker?
So I guess one thing to think about, and this is something that I've gotten from a lot of my friends in kind of this like, DAO kind of centralized autonomous organization kind of communities, is that, specifically, I think it was like the Further Field Collective, like had this sort of mantra of like culture before structure, which I think is also important to think about with the cybersyn thing. So like even if it's a secular culture, rather than kind of like, you know, something that's downstream from the church or from other religious organizations, if you kind of assume like, okay, I have this structure that I'm going to implement that's going to kind of generate this like particular like set of outcomes, in a sense that is falling into the sort of compossibility fetish of possibilism itself. Because it's like you're not looking at the actual, you know, you're thinking of it is a possibility. And I have this issue often with like the way that people talk about political platforms or like policies or like how candidates even kind of run in democracies often kind of just comes across to me like it's like they're not really talking about, you know, what is the actual situation, that like what are the cultures that we're actually working with trying to do certain things with. I'm talking about like how do I introduce a structure to recompose these elements that I'm already dehumanizing through this structure to do what I want basically, right, or what I'm saying I want, you know. So I feel like there is sort of this issue of like, you know, how do you introduce more of kind of this prioritization of what is the actual culture that is going through what it's going through to these sorts of political discussions, because yeah, I mean, I think that there is this huge danger with like having like a platform or having a structure, and like you need to think about those things, but like those kind of have to be responsive to the situation that you're in and to the people that you're working with, and like for that to be the priority, it has to be maintained for there to be like that strong sense of actuality, even without like, you know, a sort of more intense faith in a supernatural kind of ground to it. So.
I'm really curious about the theme of this concept of the worldly positive freedom, simply because the more that I thought about the horizon possibility being something that's in essence Promethean, it made me think of, I don't know, this sort of meme thing went around on the internet not so long ago, people talking about every given political ideology being possible if all of the people participating in the political ideology are the perfect people. Like a veil of ignorance. I mean, everybody behind the Rawlsian veil of ignorance is exactly. And if you get it is possibilism. It's hyper competent, and so any given political ideology could work if only everybody just knew exactly what to do. And it made me think that while it's common in debates that are Christian in character, that are post-liberal in character, to dwell intensely on all of the wildly obvious, manifold negative consequences, ramifications of the post-60s wave of liberalism. While we all are well aware of those things, and when it comes to more contemporary culture war conversations, we all share, I think, a strong antipathy towards things like pornography, things like the proliferation of ridiculous brain rot to young children on their iPads and iPhones. These are all things that we can, in essence, oppose without having...
Young men who say they're polyamorous and they can't even get one girl.
Yes, exactly. But I think there is a minority of individuals who see the enormous proliferation of negative freedom as a kind of Promethean challenge, and they enjoy it. They enjoy the role of being able to be radically free and to engage in this like Foucauldian entrepreneurship of the self, to pick and choose and wear identities like masks, and they see it as Nietzschean, as neo-pagan, and I think it's difficult to produce a case. That's why we were talking about Philip Sherrard earlier over lunch. I'm curious about a political case that can be made to people that basically says this isn't merely, post-liberalism isn't merely an incarnation of ideologies you've seen before that is censorious, that denies the primacy of the body as creative nature as well, and that I think it too aggressively polices negative freedoms that ultimately I think you're going to have a very hard time from a purely pragmatic standpoint overturning.
No, I agree.
Yeah, this is a lot of the issue that I've had kind of, and this is even kind of just on a basic personal level between like converting to Catholicism and having like Catholic friends, and then also having a lot of friends who are very, even if they're non-Catholic or like hostile to Catholicism for exactly those reasons, of sort of like, just that sense of like there's kind of an overly restrictive aspect to the way that kind of divinely mediated and regulated positive freedom within the Roman Catholic Church is sort of socially cashed out. And so a lot of people are kind of looking for, like, I guess, kind of different links in those sorts of chains that, like, don't require, I guess, the same degree of kind of, like, ascetic sacrifice. The thing about that, and, like, sort of, I kind of go back and forth on maybe being sometimes too pessimistic about this, but I do think that there's always kind of more room, and, like, as, like, if you're affirming kind of this ontology of peace, you want to sort of maintain that positive kind of trust, like, there is a possibility. Even more deeply than that, there's an actuality, but I feel like there's sort of this sense of when people in the current situation that we're in end up oftentimes unthinkingly sort of sucked into cycles of complicity with certain forms of just sort of like liberal, like licentious practices, to the point that it's kind of like even just the idea of asceticism, like in whatever minimal sense, just incorporating aspects of that into your life. Not only is it sort of something that people feel is a hostility towards them, but it can even be something that is just like fundamentally destructive of their whole social actuality. The paradox of this is that, and this is basically what kind of I think is structurally happening in the culture war overall, is that you have either kind of giving in totally to this sort of like kind of neo-hedonistic liberal lust essentially, or just any of the capital sins, but that's one of the key ones in the culture war. You end up with a situation where it's like they are kind of destroying actuality and they are kind of like sacralizing a form of negativity, but that is their actuality at the same time. That is the actuality of the culture. It is a kind of self-destructive culture. And so when you have that situation, how can you kind of say like, well, in order to achieve a more genuine, deeper actuality, how do you have to actually give up something of what seems to be actuality in order to resist the sort of drive towards the destruction of actuality. And like I think this has always been like, again, this is why I mentioned the sort of like biblical theme from the Gospels of like giving up your life to gain it. But I feel like this is kind of like the key sort of Christian insight here of like, in order to achieve a more stabilized positive horizon, or even classical virtue has a very similar narrative. In order to achieve a more stabilized positive horizon for kind of like how actuality can kind of maintain and even develop itself meaningfully, not just destroy itself, it does require some form of restriction, but it just has to be capable of being presented as an enabling constraint. And I think a lot of the sort of like disenchantment or loss of the supernatural or whatever that happens, it leads to kind of this state of like, you only see the constraints and you don't see what's enabled by them. Or like what is enabled by them is kind of very deliberately and systematically like eliminated from the discussion. So like, it just can only be talked about as concern. Like that's not real, that's not important, that's not relevant to me. And it's all I sort of experience is something different from that. So I do think that like there's a lot to kind of be demoralized by, and I'm feeling a lot of that recently, but there's also I think there's a lot of room to kind of try to stage effective interventions, which is what prioritizing actuality means. I guess, but it's not even just, there's a possibility, like I said earlier, but it's like, you actually have to act, like you have to like do things to kind of like, try to open up that space. Yeah,
you're so fundamentally accustomed to the condition of passivity. Because you either have a passive passivity in the form of apathy due to disenchantment, or an active passivity in the form of fetishizing or eroticizing one's passivity, again with the same justification. If everything really is this terrible, then surely everything is permitted, and I can give myself up to the fantasy of someone doing my desiring for me. So when that's the case, when even your forms of passivity are a choice between active passivity and passive passivity, activity in any form, like you said, even the smallest form of asceticism is felt as body blow. When I think it is possible to say that this is something that is, asceticism is a kenotic process. It is actually an emptying, it is actually a surrender, as much as it is, it's paradoxical, but as much as it is doing something or taking a step. And I think, that's something that can, if it's communicated correctly, or rather if it's understood properly, consciously by people, they're more amenable to it, rather than, I suppose it's just that in any conversation where we talk about more concrete political solutions, I'm really aware of the cultural subtext whereby everyone is just so habituated to a hedonic calculus where desires are satisfied, of all kinds, just instantaneously, in almost all spheres.
So,
I've got two questions.
do we have a question?
Yeah, it's kind of like an Irish question, I would say, but something I understand and has fun words. So by bold Gambat, if Derrida's deconstruction is always at work, how can one collect ontologically flammable material? Do you understand that?
I think I just asked why we want to set being on fire. That's my question.
Do you have time to go back and
Yeah, I'm just gonna put that out there.
why would you want to be on fire?
Where being like ontologically flammable, like yeah.
What would you?
I mean, I don't know, like
I think it just means something that's like a bit risque. What? Like something that's like dangerous to the like body politic.
What's the question again?
If Derrida's deconstruction is always at work, how can one collect ontologically flammable material?
I suppose well, it's a question of whether deconstruction is an ultimate demanding reality.
yeah, I mean, because I think deconstruction does push in this direction of again, it's this sort of sacralizing of the D and the deconstruction.
Yeah.
It's like how, you know, we don't just want to sort of set things on fire or like, you know, collect things that can be kind of combusted into something. We also want to like have like, you know, maybe there are kind of like alchemical transformations that happen, but like something has to be produced and constructed in the process. So
Yeah, it's a refusal of mediation. It's an arbitrary against. Yeah. It's the same thing in that one. So we should probably finish and advance to it's the month of August. So we're now having August.
Yeah.
August Crook, who can do what he likes in August.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's. I mean, I think
As you can see, he looks like a man of the woods.
yeah, like a green man. Yeah.
He has
I did. Yeah, I think like August is a beautiful month.
passed through Sherwood
Summer.
from the peak forest.
Yeah, and like
So
the
we
greenwood is August,
Yes.
so it kind of makes
Yeah.
sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean,
But I'm just going to
Okay.
introduce you when I can find my thing. Yes. So we're now on to the fourth section, which is entitled Rethinking Causality. Getting rid of analogy, knowledge by identity, and the primacy of the actual are three aspects of disenchantment. The fourth, according to my beyond secular order analysis, is the displacement of causal influence by causal concurrence. What do I mean by that? Well, once we lived in a Neoplatonic cosmos where lower things emanated from higher, and it was possible to say that things are caused in one sort of visible way on a lower level, and yet without comparability or competition, in that they're caused in another kind of way on a higher level. So a tree, for example, grows and has evolved in ways that are somewhat traceable. And yet it's also there, perhaps symbolically, to show us higher and hidden realities, the world tree, life itself and its ordering. We can't explain why there is a tree trying to be a tree, even if it's developed through competition. Why is it trying to be a tree at all? At the apex, we can say all is entirely caused by God, yet not in an interfering way. Yet in the modern paradigm that has deep roots with Duns Scotus and other people in the Middle Ages, God is in competition with lower causes. He's either an intervening God or a redundant God. Either he's then an idol or he does not exist. So the same pattern repeats itself at an immanent level within politics. The state or government must be one causal factor, it's supposed, in competition with those other factors and people that it's supposed to govern. Everything, everywhere, according to this false vision, is in rivalry, only controllable by the balance of powers, as with the American Constitution. But this liberalism, it seems, in our own time, is now collapsing, and perhaps collapsing forever and irretrievably. We need instead a paradoxical mixture of genuine hierarchy and horizontal participation. Different social levels can cooperate because they're not inherently in rivalry. Rulers should offer holistic vision and guidance. The people offer continuous feedback involved in trying to work this vision out. Much more feedback than was involved in the Middle Ages. Nobody's proposing to go back there. In between, there should be many mediating bodies and corporations, themselves represented within a shared horizon of value. This political new order should both reflect and help to realize a rethought perennial metaphysical vision, nonetheless rendered modern and dynamic in terms of natural metamorphosis and human creativity. Nature turns into human beings, and human beings are inherently ordered through language, art and technology beyond themselves towards a transfigured cosmos and towards the absolute or God. We need perhaps a religious transhuman vision, might be the question here. In this vision, our finite causal operations are always guided by transcendent and hidden causes, drawing us forwards and upwards. How can we advance towards this post-democratic as well as post-liberal, but not anti-democratic, sense of a human practice as a collective poesis? Is this not what we need in order to transcend both liberal empty globalism and the quasi-religion of pagan and atavistic nationalism? Because we're only going to be able to defeat dominant liberal and capitalism at a global level, something that most post-liberals, or people calling themselves that, are at the moment ignoring. Okay, back to you.
Yeah, I'll just say my talk is like slightly messy in some aspects, like completely fit together perfectly, but the point is fairly simple, and I think it's very good that it came at this time, because it kind of gives us a perfect thing to talk about at the end. It's kind of like, I suppose, a criticism of post-liberalism itself and radical orthodoxy by somewhat of an extension. Not really a criticism, but I think like the fundamental post-liberalism will only become post-liberalism like when it can critique itself, I suppose. Point, but I'll go into it now. My talk is about how current post-liberalism is in danger of falling back into the modern and liberal structures of an authoritarian nihilism, and how it can escape that danger and press on to a truly post-liberal future by a more generous and magnanimous relationship to what it perceives to be its opposition. This danger is discussed in the context of an analysis of the contrasting causal models of concurrence and influence. Okay, so let's talk about concurrence and influence. The idea of concurrence is that all causes share a univocal medium that determines their nature as causes. Therefore, to say a cause causes its effect, you have to have something that's in cause, medium, and effect in the same univocal way, which is opposed to an influence model, which is analogical, where we can have something like God causing creatures, whilst maintaining analogical difference with the creatures. And this need not only to apply to God, but there can be many other causes of the influence model, such as Aristotelian final causes. A problem with this concurrence model of causation is all causes share this one univocal medium, and therefore the strength of one cause is the diminishment of another, in a sort of zero-sum way, as they are all fighting for a piece of the same causal pie. And then I heard a joke saying, it's a bit disrespectful to make God fight for pie, but then put it out, but to non-language. So just the point. Yeah, it's an informative joke there. It also produces excessive dualism, as you either have this univocal causal nature or you don't. Whereas with the influence model of causation, there are many ways of being a cause. And lastly, the very quiddity of the cause itself gets more and more reduced to being a mere differential quantum, pure power. And perhaps you'll recognise this zero-sum dualistic battle over the same, or rather ever-decreasing, pie for the purpose of the acquisition of ever more power and money in modern politics and society. It is the road of entropy and nihilism. In this talk, I want to show how radical orthodoxy and post-liberalism can be in danger of replicating the concurrence model of causation, which they criticise, and thereby falling back into this modern nihilism. Firstly, I'll give a brief description or interpretation of radical orthodoxy and how it relates to that which is said to oppose. And this rhetoric gets disjointed, but it does actually have to follow pretty simply. Radical orthodoxy highlights the rigid and shallow univocal notions that entrap us in this ever more sterile and destructive modernity. It it also shows a somewhat ancient and orthodox way of conceiving of the world. I will read a quote from Aristotle's Metaphysics that shows how radical orthodoxy is genuinely orthodox through great expanses of time and space. It speaks to something almost or actually perennial. It's quite bold claim, but it's quite true. And also I think, we can say Aristotle is radical orthodox and Trinitarian as well.
Sounds like Dante. You sort of
Why?
letting him really down. Yeah.
No, he's in his own.
I just use it.
We should also consider tradition. From old and indeed extremely ancient times, there has been handed down to our later age imitations of a mythical character, the effect that the stars are gods and that the divine embraces the whole of nature. If then we discard these creations and consider the central feature, that they held the primary substances to be gods, we might well believe the claim to have been directly inspired. We might also conclude that while it is highly probable that all possible arts and doctrines have been many times discovered and lost, these ancient cosmologies have been preserved, like holy relics right up to the present day. It is these and these alone that we can know clearly the ancestral, indeed primordial beliefs. I kind of like that phrase. It's kind of mysterious. Yeah, it's like, what is this mysterious divine history that he's talking about, and what actually do you know about these ancient beliefs? But I think it's kind of true that there is like some sort of mystical history and continuity.
It shows how Platonic Aristotle is.
He is, yeah, very Platonic.
Yeah.
But I suppose the point is that like it does kind of show. I mean, it's Aristotle saying his thought is primordial, and I would say your radical orthodox thought is quite similar to Aristotelian thought. So I think Aristotle is right that there is a primordial and perennial way of looking at this world, somewhat perennial. I put it in brackets away, because perennialism is a very universalistic absolute claim, but it has a perennial aspect, and which can be characterised as the belief that through mediation of the world we can encounter directly, but analogically, divinity and the very truth of being. This aligns with radical orthodoxy. Radical orthodoxy especially emphasises the role of mediating entities in revealing an analogical God. The fundamental antagonism to this middle position of mediating truth comes quite logically from the extremes, i.e. those who want a pure transcendence and those who want a pure immanence. And of course these two extremes mutually create each other in certain ways. The Reformation provides a classic example of a strong desire for the salvation of a pure encounter with God, leading to a general disenchantment and the hardening of a cold immanence. Going further back, we see it in the Jewish quest for the absolute, leading to a certain worldliness, which those would seem like their ritual practices and various other things. However, personally, I am kind of supportive of the strong desire for salvation and the absolute. I do have this absolutist tendency. I want my salvation, as well as a rigorous, immanent, and somewhat disenchanted. And also, I like a kind of rigorous, immanent, and somewhat disenchanted ordering of the world. And also, I think it's important to bring God into the world through mediation. So I think all of these things are good and important, and they need each other to achieve their proper end. And also, one might think Christianity managed to combine in harmony all these things. I think radical orthodoxy can include a desire for a more absolutist communion with God, as well as the desire for the calm, security, and order given by a sort of univocal immanentism, which one could also call liberalism. This inclusion, I believe, is properly Christian and Trinitarian. However, in radical orthodoxy, this inclusivity is not always so evident, and one can see a rather severe differentiation and dualism between modernity and the orthodox, liberalism and post-liberalism, the way of mediation and the way of the more absolutist spirituality. In this way, it doesn't seem like an influence model of causation, where these various essential forces can grow and recede organically, but it has the more zero-sum and dualistic nature of the concurrence model, which has the effect of making it more a battle of univocal power than of tending to the flourishing of analogical goodness. And we can see this preponderance towards cultural dualities and nihilistic assertions of pure power in the more vulgar post-liberalisms that are popping up. However, radical orthodoxy can solve this problem within itself and show the way to a genuine post-liberalism that doesn't get sucked back into the modern nihilistic quest for power and domination by absolving itself of some of its own potentialities for the concurrence model of causation, as well as the univocity, possibilism, ideality, and excessive dualism that goes with this model of causation. It shows us how to go forward with post-liberalism by ironically being kinder to liberalism in a kind of Christ-like maybe. So it is a going forward and not going back.
It is important to see liberalism has as well as certain more hyperbolic and salvationist spiritualities, as not mere ideal oppositions, but to see them in their real and rich, complex histories and being. The victory of a true and virtuous post-liberalism will come when we can ever more step out of these reductive and destructive structures and open ourselves to a more generous and receptive encounter with the plurality of social forces. And through this will come cooperation, creativity, and ultimately love, and then the creation of new forms of sociality that with their truth, beauty and goodness, with their actuality and generosity, with their love will create the reality of a post-liberal world. And this goes into Anna's possibilism thing, I'm just saying.
Yeah.
we need to do lots of crazy things.
So we've had a kind of sympathetic northern...
Yeah, my Quaker roots. I'm not having you dissing it.
Quaker critique
neo-medievalism.
Of kind of East Anglian, Thaxted, romantic, and so that's, Adrian, would you like to come back on that?
Yeah, no, look, I suppose a couple of things come to mind. I mean, the first is, if we start from, something more, more immediate, like politics, then, I think it's also clear that politics only works by drawing very, very clear lines of contrast and opposition. In some sense, without at all endorsing, the philosophy of Carl Schmitt, in politics you do need enemies.
Yeah, that's true.
And if you don't have enemies in politics, then you're not really defining not just a political position, but you're not really defining the debate and what the real, what the real stake or stakes are that you're trying to highlight. So I think that there's a sort of bit of a tension between that and I suppose the quest for reconciliation, for forgiveness, for creating something truly universal that everyone can be a part of, and as you said, in some sense, what would Christ do? How would Christ, sort of position, his teaching in relation, say, to liberalism, if that was if that was one of the sort of bodies of ideas that he might have engaged with. But we also know from the gospel that Christ did not hesitate naming the enemy. And in that sense, I don't think we have to be either too purist, right, and say we're going to sort of insist on a single position, that is it, and then be very exclusive in the way that you rightly critique. Nor, I think, can we be all too sort of forced ecumenical and say, oh well, there may be some differences, but really we can all be friends and we can all be kind to each other. I'm not entirely sure how we draw the line, but I don't think that having some very clear dividing lines isn't necessary and important. Now, I think where you're absolutely right is philosophically that fundamental difference of causality is one we really need to insist, because I think that is where we don't go so hopelessly wrong in the way that you said that. Ultimately, it's all about bias, and that whatever form you look at, it slides into nihilism, and I think in that sense you're absolutely right. We need to defend this notion that everything comes from God, everything can only fully unfold in its sort of ontological plenitude and flourish thanks to God's co-creative activity, and ultimately everything returns to God. And that is the metaphysics that we absolutely defend. How we translate that then into something, whether at the level of politics or culture, the economy, society, I'm not entirely certain. So what I'm saying is I agree with you philosophically 100%. I think in terms of being kinder to liberalism, I suppose I'll finish on this, that where liberalism is open to metaphysical mediation, to participation, to that account of causality, where liberalism does not insist it has a monopoly on anything, where liberalism actually makes a contribution to human flourishing, sure, we should certainly be kind. But I think the moment liberalism, I don't mean this in a historical sense, at a particular point in time, but philosophically and politically, the moment liberalism insists on its deep voluntarist and nominalist roots, the moment liberalism defends a conception of the individual as either totally sort of isolated or in any case as the highest moral sort of authority, where liberalism insists on volition as the highest faculty rather than the intellect, and so on and so forth, we must draw the line, and we cannot be kind to that, because I think that would be ultimately undermining our own position. And ultimately undermining the conditions for anything like reconciliation, forgiveness, even peace. So I agree with you philosophically. I don't entirely agree with you politically. And I think it's really reminding liberalism of its own religious roots that can be the redemption of liberalism. If we had a liberal renewal along the lines of the more religious liberals, or even more recently the new liberals, T.H. Green, Hobson and Hobhouse, and recovering that more social embedding of liberalism, fine. But when we're dealing with the liberalism of either Hobbes and Locke, or the liberalism of Bentham and Mill, no, we absolutely must draw them.
Yeah, no, I think it's a bit more. But one thing, are you saying politics is like give it over to this concurrent model of causation and philosophy is over to the individual?
No, I'm not saying that. All I'm saying is that I think there's a difference between philosophy and politics in the sense that, in politics as a practice, as an activity, you do have to name the enemy. You cannot start with the let's be kind and let's first work towards reconciliation. Reconciliation should be the ultimate thing, but in politics you've got to draw the line. Otherwise, you cannot change the terms of debate and the polity you live in. You're giving too much into the kind of prevailing powers. If you start with let's be kind to well, you did say that you had to liberal. Which I'm clearly reacting to.
Part of what I was getting at with this concurrence analogy is, as you really, really well put it, you can't think of God as competing precisely the point.
Totally.
I think this is our problem also with sort of thinking about the state. That the state has become a professional, bureaucratic thing over against us from sort of early modern times onwards, rather than something sort of organically connected, like it's sort of operating as a formal or final cause that's sort of inherently a part of society, and is not, and it is sort of an architectonic power. It's not in competition, at least in principle, and need not necessarily be in competition. So, whereas I think that liberalism has a tendency to think that you can, that everything is really competing with everything else, and therefore you need an organising force to have a balance of powers, but that in itself will then be competing with things underneath it, and we kind of need to dispense with this model. But as to your other points, I mean, first of all, liberal is a really confusing term. Adrian and I have been using it partly as a term of art to mean, individualist foundationalism, metaphysically and politically. But we're not just making this up, because it's kind of there in Hobbes and to an extent in Locke. And also often in English tradition, liberalism has meant something like individualism. It does in Mill, even though he qualifies it with both Kantian and Coleridgean elements. Even himself sometimes sounding, a bit like a new liberal. But I mean, on the continent, liberalism is usually in the 19th century meant democracy, or something like constitutional rule. And we're not opposing liberalism in that sense, nor are we opposing liberalism in the sense of a broadly generous outlook, rather than a sort of punitive, non-sympathetic outlook. So, in terms of justice, crime and punishment issues, I'm really quite liberal. I think criminals should be caught, and people should be protected. But I have a rather Aristotelian notion of punishment as sort of healing and restitution, rather than
vindictive punishment.
Vindictive punishment is actually modern liberal and Kantian, and trying to persuade populace in
Yeah.
cafes about this. It's quite hot, but
Yeah.
nonetheless, I have to stick to my philosophical guns at that point. So, only in such specific senses are we critical of liberal, and the whole new liberal trajectory from T.H. Green onwards, which was always kind of a beleaguered minority, but they were definitely trying to incorporate elements of positive liberty, not just, you need to be socially enabled to make freedom, but some things are worth more things than others. And even Mill is forced into saying that in the end. So we're not, liberalism in the sense of, neoliberalism, we're not opposing. And then, the final thing I wanted to say is you're right that just as capitalist competition has, powered in real inventions and goods, because if you're competing, you have to find new things, and some of those things are good things, although it's a bit random. And so also kind of negative freedom, trying to make people have more freedom of choice, has obviously produced some goods, that people have chosen good things, new creative powers have emerged, and so on. But as a kind of absolute principle and becoming, fully unleashed without qualification, say since the 60s, as you said, it then becomes problematic. And also, but, we can't absolutely agree about everything. So, there is a place for liberalism and negative freedom, but we never can deny that.
Yeah.
And it's much more that we're saying, liberalism is not enough. And so that, to some extent, I would see, so often people criticising radical orthodoxy, it's a bit of a phantom you're criticising, perhaps.
Well, man, I don't know. Because if you think in terms of politics, so if everybody's sort of separating into narrow, sort of dualities and this cultural.
Yeah, but it's not us. It's not us. Yeah.
Well, yeah, but it's
a lot of American post-liberals.
Yeah,
sure.
Yeah, but so has a good post-liberal gesture is to sort of kind of go beyond the binaries that you've created and sort of try and look more at liberalism as a real phenomenon, unless it's a sort of ideological
I think Adrian and I have tried to say the ways in which we would do that, but maybe you don't see it as enough. But,
no, it's not really that. It's just I just think as in this moment of post-liberalism, I think showing its sort of generosity to its other is what will kind of really guarantee its future has post-liberalism. Because it's that ability to incorporate other elements that makes you strong.
Well, I'm trying to be, I think we're trying to be as generous as we can be without sort of, compromising on essentials. But would other people?
Yeah. Maybe just very briefly on that.
Yeah.
So, sure, of course you're right that, there's no point in perpetuating antagonism for the sake of it. I suppose the reason why we've positioned it in this way is precisely first of all, we're escaping from the usual dualisms of left, right, state marker, individual, collective, and all of the kind of dualisms, that have been bequeathed to us by, secular modernity in general, and the French Revolutionary settlement in particular, and indeed the American Revolutionary settlement too. Because in some sense, the liberal, non-liberal difference, is more fundamental, because ultimately both the American and French Revolution were liberal revolutions.
Yeah.
Okay, and since we are not on the side of those two revolutions, or indeed the Russian one that came later, that seemed like philosophically, politically, the right way to position the argument. So that's
I agree.
Why that because also even today, even in the world of technocracy, but liberal technocracy, you might say, versus sort of illiberal populism, if any of those labels make a lot of sense. It remains the case, if John and I have argued, that actually a number of populists are quite liberal. In economic terms, for instance. The Trump administration, it's just lower taxes for the wealthy and is pushing a deregulatory agenda that completely serves the interests of Silicon Valley and Wall Street, which is something we totally oppose. And it's also trying to destroy the remnants of the New Deal in terms of labour unions and bargaining and so on, as Sohrab Ahmari and others have clearly shown. So that's where we oppose the Trump administration, where it's actually economically far too liberal. And yes, of course, we also oppose the Trump administration or the Orban government when they are illiberal or let's be very clear, anti-liberal on things like, for instance, the free press or free speech or whatever it might be. So President Trump pretends to be on the side of free speech, and yet he's also undermining free speech in his own way. He's not actually reversing cancelling culture. He's now counter-cancelling. He's not cancelling the people that he doesn't like. And there we are as critical of the Democrats when they were trying to wage warfare against his candidacy as we would be critical of the Trump administration counter-cancelling voices it doesn't like. So let's be very clear, we are not on the side of illiberal or anti-liberal forces at all. We've consistently tried to chart, in the spirit of Catholic social thought and in the spirit of Christian social teaching more generally, the alternative to the prevailing categories. And that includes nowadays those who are attacking what we think are generous, tolerant liberal institutions, like, for instance, we're totally for the free press.
Yeah.
What we don't want to see in the mainstream press or the new press is total manipulation of opinion. What we don't want to see is essentially, what we all call, demagogic or sort of, or sophistic or relativistic tendencies. But are we in favour of the free press? Totally. Are we in favour of independent courts? Always. Are we in favour of liberal constitutionalism properly understood?
Trial by jury.
Trial by jury, for instance, rather than this idea that in the name of saving money we should abolish trial by jury. That's nonsense.
Yeah.
So we're actually defending some of the most noble liberal traditions against all of their enemies. But what we're not going to be doing is sort of starting with, I'm now caricaturing, vastly, but we're not going to start saying that let's all be kind to liberals because in the end they're not the worst. Well, the trouble is, there's also such a thing as liberal fascism, and that needs to be confronted in the harshest possible term. That's why, again, in politics, you need to draw lines.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of identifying the enemy, I can see how liberalism is an enemy, but I can also see other things like nihilism and that could be.
It's
not really.
Sure, but the whole point is, since nihilism can also be liberal, I don't make a difference there. I just, there's nihilism, we need to confront it, be it of a liberal kind or an illiberal kind. That's, in that sense, their nihilism, as you quite rightly point out in your talk, much more fundamental and a much greater threat than anything that's ideological. Because ultimately, you look, all political ideologies and traditions are downstream from metaphysics, are downstream from philosophical traditions. So absolutely, let's confront nihilism. Let's confront the sort of deep relativism and absolutism at the heart of the modern project. The ideologies are, in some sense, neither here nor there.
Yeah, I think just about introducing a bit more flexibility and a bit more sort of openness, which will just benefit post-liberalism basically. Because if there's lots of post-liberals going in like kind of more opposite, more negative way, falling into this sort of basically liberal pattern of like power games and stuff. I think to define this new positive post-liberalism, I think a more positive appreciation of liberalism is a good way of signalling that you're a grown-up ideology and you can absorb elements from your opposition.
Well, it depends what that means, but let other people come in.
I think liberal is a word that's so difficult to pin down and such a cipher for so many different things. I think I'd start with maybe one that's something we could all unequivocally, especially as English or British people agree, is the good form of liberalism, which is, I know the expression small c conservative is much more common, but the small l liberal in, quite specifically I think the English context, perhaps to a lesser extent the Welsh context, is the belief in a notion of fair play, common decency, you don't cheat at games, being spiteful is a terrible thing.
You don't win games by sledging.
Yes, you don't. Yeah,
Would you say cricket then? After you check cricket
in the sense of being, civil, generous, and tolerant, totally.
It's the good conduct on the cricket pitch. And I'm not necessarily being glib here. I remember a friend telling me that he thought the difference between having lived in Germany and Britain, he said, at 1 in the morning I would watch a chap in an Audi on a completely deserted country road, stop at a red light, wait for the full 20 seconds and then proceed. Whereas he said, a country road in Britain, you might stop at the red light, you look around, and 5 seconds later you go, oh, I could probably go, can't I? And it's that sense of a belief in fair play, common decency that isn't really particularly ideologically specific. It's definitely culturally specific. There are areas of the greater Anglosphere where this sort of It's actually, it's one George Orwell talked about too. You might find it in Canada, in slightly less proliferated, perhaps a little less in Australia and New Zealand now today than it once did. But then liberal, because it's such a capacious term, besides the political party to which it refers or the given ideological moment, it's generally understood, whether in its truncated pejorative form lib or various other forms that I'm not going to say aloud, to mean the enemy, to mean either they're cringe and they're annoying, all the way to they want to destroy you and they think it's fun. So I agree, fundamentally, knowing who your enemy is, and in the context of understanding liberalism as the enemy, is a vital task for any post-liberal. But the question is, how is this exactly articulated? Well, I think pragmatically, you need to have a thoroughgoing understanding that the people who are in charge of institutions at the moment sign up to some such form of left-of-centre liberalism, right-of-centre liberalism, or another. I'm sure you could mention all sorts of other ideologies with whom we share profound philosophical disagreements and with whom we would not want to break bread. But the fact of the matter is they're not the ones who we will need to challenge in order to actually exercise real power and authority. And to the end that we should act pragmatically to secure that power, I think observing that in a purely kind of pragmatic sense in politics there are friends and enemies, and what this means is that your friends will say, oh, you're being a really sensible, grown-up bipartisan by compromising and agreeing to work with lots of other political parties, and your enemies will say, this Richard III is changing his masks and shapes with protests for advantages. I think if there's one fair play principle you can boil it down to, and this is something that I think we're probably all so tired of in contemporary political discourse, never acting out of a desire to humiliate the political enemy or out of spite. There's a great deal of political discourse today in legacy media and online. I don't think it's unique, just the online sphere, in which it seems that the really quite base libidinal desire to see the enemy humiliated or mocked, it takes the place even of actual political gain or change. Merely the desire to, épater le bourgeois or to troll someone seems to fulfill a kind of, it lets loose a psychic release valve. And I think, first of all, if it becomes clear to everybody in a given political discourse that you are being honest and you are never spiteful, everyone respects you.
Yeah.
Everyone respects you. And the other thing it does is it stops you from giving into a kind of Dorian Gray type urge that will only become worse over time. The moment I think you begin to indulge in, mockery of the enemy or bringing them low to make them look stupid, the moment that you engage in that form of sledging, you like it and you keep doing it, and you end up creating a discourse in which this becomes completely normalised.
And it becomes very corrosive.
Yes.
But it also reminds me of the following saying by a former Labour MP who I think was a member of the House of Commons for over 50 years, passed away probably a decade or so now ago, called Sir Gerald Kaufman, who used to say this: never kick a man until he's down. And that, I think, in political terms, or parliamentarian terms, may well be true, as in, that's what people end up doing. But as you say, that is not in the spirit of fair play. And you're right, it's very, very close. It's still a good line, though.
Yes.
He's the same guy who said the wrong suicide note in history about the 83 protest.
Well, any more comments? Anna, anybody?
I guess just one thought on the sort of humiliation thing. I feel like at the same time that it's always good to try to avoid broadly, whether you want to narrativize it as sort of sinful behavior or just sort of behavior that is ultimately purely negative, not destructive, whatever. I think that it can be extremely hard, especially right now, to understand the contemporary political landscape without sort of trying to make sense of what is happening, not even with those people sort of extending charity even to the people who don't extend charity. So kind of understanding you know, so much of the discourse now is just this, endlessly, that it's like if you're trying to sort of like avoid it, if you're trying to like not participate in it at all, you can end up in a position where it's like, in some sense, you've prevented yourself from even making sense of it, and that it's sort of just beyond the pale completely, and it's, you know, you in a sense you lose the political because you are trying so hard to kind of like, you know, be admirable. And I mean, I think that this is sort of ultimately like, you know, the role more of like a religious vocation than a political one, because it's like, you know, even if it's sort of politics taken towards like a barely sublimated military limit of like, this is like a war in some sense discursively, what does characterize politics is that there is sort of just this struggle and this negativity, and that's also why politics is not really ultimately sort of sufficient for human life, because like it does bring that into it sort of by necessity, even if it's like, and in some cases I feel like there is sort of like something offensive in like, you know, trying not to humiliate someone and then sort of still doing it, you know what I mean, where it's like to kind of avow it more directly can actually be in some ways like allow for a better conversation between people, to kind of like be kind of just more honest and straightforward in that kind of way. So I don't know, I guess part of just my experience with like online politics in that sense has been that like, I feel like I've gained some by just being able to like try to understand that standpoint of like being kind of lost in that space, and like, you know, why people are doing that and what kind of they're trying to get to. But when I try to engage with that, and like I, you know, lost myself to it at different points in the past as well, but I think the best way to engage with those people is to try to kind of raise their trolling to principles. So to sort of say like, you know, what are you actually like, what do you actually stand for? Because a lot of them don't stand for anything, and like that kind of is like, it's actually the more subversive thing to do is to like, you know, attribute them standing for something to them. And say like, you know, well, is this what you actually stand for? Is this what you actually believe in? And is what you're doing ultimately undermining it or not? Like, is this what it is, right? Because it's like, I feel like there is this thing to kind of pull people back from that edge. But I don't know, I mean, a lot of us are just not in a good position to do that all the time.
If we're talking about causes not in competition, how does this apply to issues that we haven't sort of engaged with so far? You know, can there be an international order that's not simply in competition with national orders? Are we content just with nation states negotiating with each other? That doesn't seem to resolve the problems of a dominant international corporate capitalism. So, you know, what kind of international order can we have that's not like an elite global thing that's suppressing the national and the local? Or how do we relate to nature while transcending it but not oppressing it? Or how do we relate to machines that they don't transcend and oppress us? So these relationships to nature, to machines, to the globe, we don't seem to have addressed very much. And I don't know whether anybody, before we get to the end, has got anything to say about those issues.
Britain is very much perfectly placed to sort of create like a sort of multilateral system in some ways of its history of empires. And also just being like a relatively small country, because America doesn't really have much vested interest, I suppose, in creating these multilateral institutions, because it's like inherently very powerful.
Well, it's losing that.
But it seems like middle countries are going to have more, like a kind of slightly smaller country is going to have more, and the European Union in general could be part of that, has like, they would have more of a vested interest, you would have thought, in creating like a sort of multilateral sort of...
Adrian, I think to go back to the very important point made by Alfred about fair play, which I think is both a cultural specificity, but I think there's something universal about it, which is again that fundamental decency. You know, it's the fundamental respect that you accord everyone, rather than sort of more antagonistic, zero-sum sort of game type logic. So, starting from that, you know, what could be the role of sort of, you know, mid-sized powers such as Britain or France or or Germany, or indeed in other parts of the world. And I think it's sort of almost the role of umpire, is that, so they can play a mediating role between the larger countries, between, say, the United States or China or, maybe even Russia at some point in the future, or indeed trying to bring Iran back, from its, awful theocracy back into something that's, much more in line with Persian pluralism and civilization that isn't the corrupt regime of the Shah. So there's all sorts of things that we as sort of people from mid-sized countries should explore. And Britain can do it through the Commonwealth, France can do it through sort of links it has to the countries of the francophonie. Spain can do it with its with the countries that were once part of the Spanish Empire, etc. I think the fundamental question is still that we don't fall into the trap of what some organisations have sadly become, which is they are at once too formalistic, like for instance the UN Security Council, where nothing is moving because essentially the 5 permanent members can just neutralise each other's veto power, and sort of nothing gets really resolved on the one hand. On the other hand, it's also, in some sense, too shallow when it comes to substantive things, just because there isn't anyone who's committed to setting an agenda, a substantive program with which others can engage, because everyone is acting just out of narrow national self-interest. So we have a kind of problem there. We stuck with these institutions that don't work. I mean, they were a good idea. They were the right idea after World War II, but now they really seem like they're a barrier, right? Because you don't get absurd situations. You either come to a terrible compromise, because otherwise it's going to be vetoed, or there's just total paralysis. So, what's the answer? I don't know. I think the answer has to be that we try and identify, wherever possible, converging national interests, but not just narrowly defined, but define, what works for us as nations and peoples, not just in the immediate, but in the medium or long term. So how can we act together, to tackle, for instance, attack platforms? The answer is not, for Trump to defend them just because they're American, and hence they kind of apparently are part of his, Make America Great Again agenda, nor is it for the European Union simply to tax them. It's for us as countries, allies, in a kind of Bretton Woods spirit of mutual protection, to say we want tech platforms because they're full of advancement, potentially, but not when they're in the hands of private oligarchs. And even Trump, I think, deep down, will recognise, as obviously his fallout with Musk raises major questions over Musk's power base. Right? So if Trump can follow through on that logic and say, well, look, Elon Musk is potentially a threat to me and to America, well, the same is true of all the other tech platforms. Like, how can we therefore reform them together rather than have punitive taxes or, kind of champion them just because they happen to be national businesses? So, that needs to be sort of part of this conversation. Likewise with technology and the environment, it really has to be thought along the lines of relationality, being open to co-creation, because ultimately that's how the creative God works. It doesn't work in this sort of intervening, meddling sense, nor in the kind of absent sense, but through co-creation and through association. It has to be, we have to pluralize power, because power at the moment in economic or political terms is far too concentrated.
And it would seem as if Europe is the most likely to be open to this sort of guild, socialist, plural corporatist kind of vision that we're talking about, rather than America that is so wedded to this individualism, and China that is still this kind of collectivist communism at bottom. And is it impossible for Britain and France and Iberia to sort of renew their cultural links with their ex-empires, and somehow to offer them less zero-sum modes of trade and linking economies that involve greater kind of balance? Is this an impossible dream that we have a more sort of proactive Europe? But the EU doesn't look to be going in that way. But can we imagine a sort of Britain, France, Iberia alliance because of our more global legacies?
But it's very interesting how.
All this crazy thing.
It's very interesting how like this sort of mutualistic system so naturally dovetails with post-liberalism and this radical orthodoxy idea. So it shows that there's something to it because that sort of consistency is strong.
Well, look, I mean, where we are absolutely not with some of the post-liberals in America, I go back to the point where, sometimes you have to draw clear lines, you have to know, where the disagreements lie. We fundamentally disagree with this idea that national sovereignty is absolute, or even that it is the highest level of political authority. It is not. And partly because I think we're here, to be very, very frank, we're here more Christian and more Catholic.
Of course.
Because we believe in forms of universal authority as well as national authority. That's one big disagreement. Another big disagreement, certainly with, cell-style post-liberals in America who also call themselves national conservatives, that we're far, far more critical of capitalism. I mean, they say that they sort of want a more responsible market, and they believe that the state should have a role, but we cannot see how they can get to a different economic system just because they're endorsing the nation state, which has been the greatest engine of capitalism. So therefore, it's a fundamental contradiction that I think those post-liberals have never resolved, point 2. Point 3 is, linked to both those 2 points, we are unashamedly internationalist. And we're unashamedly internationalist just because we're communitarian. We believe that forms of group, corporation and association can happen at all levels. They can happen at the hyper-local level, your street, your neighbourhood, all the way to the globe, and every level in between. And we don't make a difference. So this is where we disagree with J.D. Vance when he says essentially order more stops at the national border. I'm now only really summarising his position. It's of course we love our family and our compatriots more than we love people at the other end of the globe, naturally. And Augustine, of course, makes that very point. But love does not stop at the national border. And if it's about showing compassion and deep respect for refugees, then that always has to be part. And to say just because we have very high levels of economic migration or immigration that we absolutely need to reduce, that there is no space for political refugees. The British people have been very, very, very supportive of help to people from Hong Kong and from Ukraine, and quite rightly so. And so again, this is not about technocracy versus populism. The people are compassionate because they're decent, and it's the elites that aren't decent. As Christopher Lasch, of course, was the first one to diagnose.
I think that's another way in which we're critical of too many post-liberals. That we definitely don't see green issues as some kind of sort of woke veganism or something like this. Climate change is real and probably mostly humanly caused. Species deprivation is real, and Pache, the current government, is not a choice between, butterflies and people. If there are no more butterflies or insects, there aren't going to be more people. Right? This doesn't mean that we're necessarily catastrophists, but there are real green issues to be faced, and we need a post-liberal account of ecology, and as the Pope Francis put it, an integral ecology that doesn't subordinate, that recognises humanity at the apex of nature, but nonetheless, again, it's this paradoxical. In one sense, we're at the apex, but in another, we're within nature, and if the cosmos goes, we go as well. In resistance to sort of real transhumanist nutters in Russia who want to destroy nature. So we need an account of ecology that isn't sort of sacrificing. This is another mode of sacrifice. Sacrificing people, especially poorer people, in the present, or just middle class.
Oh yeah, living up to
So there needs to be a real account of how we fulfil energy needs, and then a kind of honest debate. Are we going to? Would perhaps a society where you can buy fewer things but they're better quality, would that be better? So are we trying to fully power the way we live now, or are we prepared to qualify that? And even if we need an awful lot of power, how are we going to get it? Is that going to be a combination of nuclear with some, with quite a lot of renewables and maybe even other sources? How do we sort of run down polluting sources, but in a way that is viable? And why isn't there that same debate? It doesn't seem to exist, and post-liberals should be promoting that debate, and likewise they should be promoting a proper debate about AI. How do we have it so that it doesn't embed actually human decisions forever? How do we keep human beings intervening? How to explain the weird things AI can apparently do, as if it has some weird sort of unconscious teleology. How do we allow for that without fantasies that it really is, conscious? And ultimately, sort of how do you embed technology within art? I always think that's the Italian approach. You don't knock down the arch, you make the fiat that will go through the arch. So how do you support that technology to art, to ritual, in maybe the way that traditional Chinese societies managed to do? But again, that would mean you recover the metaphysical and religious horizon. Otherwise, to revert to possibility, if it can be done, it will be done. We don't ask questions of how it's done, and we assume that the way we do technology is not already anticipating how it will be used, which in reality it is, but we haven't really got time to discuss those questions, but I think it's worth mentioning them because they have to be part of a proper thinking through of post-liberalism, but that at the moment really, I don't think, has yet occurred, or not fully occurred. So, have we had any interventions from outside?
Oh yeah, something kind of difficult to comprehend again. So this is by Bold Cambat, and he says,
Good old Bold.
Yeah, good old Bold, yeah. Can the radical ever be nurtured within orthodoxy? Or must it always erupt where orthodoxy collapses under the weight of its own totalising harmony? Is this the moment when contingency becomes fire and thought becomes flame?
I mean, my very brief reaction is my very brief reaction is that there is no fundamental contradiction between radicalism and orthodoxy, because ultimately no one here, and certainly no one among the post-liberals that we are a part of, would ever be arguing for some status quo ante before liberalism emerged or became hegemony, or some golden age which never existed and never will. So it's not about going back, it's about recovering our own best traditions, however long ago they might have emerged, and renewing them for this age and going forward. So, at the end of the day, the agenda is not a golden age in the past or doing something completely new that's never existed. It's to combine tradition with transformation. That's the agenda, and nothing else.
Brilliant. So, getting back to radical orthodoxy, which is where it all began.
Exactly.
We'll end this 4-hour broadcast seminar there, and I hope everybody here, the thousands have enjoyed it, and everybody who's heard it virtually, and everybody who's going to hear it in the future. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.